welcome everyone to this panel of the IPO Education Foundation annual award ceremony. We're so pleased that you're able to join this amazing virtual event. This panel is entitled How IP Accelerates Innovation. And I'm Dave Kappos, your moderator. We have three outstanding speakers with us today. The first is Andrei Iancu, Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and Director of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Second, Zorina, Professor of Economics at Bowdoin College. And third, Irving Wladowsky-Berger, who is at MIT. I am Dave Kappos. I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel. And again, thank you all for joining. The way we're going to conduct this today is to have each of the speakers make some introductory comments on the broad topic of how IP accelerates innovation. And then after that, we'll have what I hope will be a discussion that I'll try and help moderate the number of questions between the panelists and see if we can bring out some other topics at the intersection of intellectual property and innovation. And so with that, I am now going to turn it over to Director Iancu to make some opening remarks. Director Iancu.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for moderating this panel. Thank you also for your past service to our nation in the position that I now occupy as Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I'm sure that it was as challenging and exciting of a post for you back then as it is for me now. There really isn't ever a dull moment, is there? Let me start with giving a bit of a status of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and then also talk a bit about the topic at hand. And I very much look forward to the upcoming discussion. We are all constantly striving to improve the U.S. system of protecting our nation's most valuable asset, our intellectual property. To everyone involved in the IPO Education Foundation, thank you for all you do to promote both intellectual property and the importance of the work that we do at the US PTO. For example, your IP Patch, Innovator Spotlight, IP video series, podcasts, and other programs are so important in today's knowledge-based economy, where we need to activate a new generation of inventors and entrepreneurs. They complement many of our programs here at the USPTO, such as Camp Invention, the Inventor Card Series, and our Science and Innovation video series, and so much more. Now, let me give you a quick update on the USPTO. The pandemic has made it a tough year for everyone. But here at the USPTO, we have been operating without pause since we adopted 100% teleworking for our 13,000 employees back in March 2020. All of our operations continue to work smoothly in the virtual world, including all of our examinations and board hearings. Despite the pandemic and the lockdowns, we did eke out a small increase this year in patent filings. And we set a new yearly record for trademark applications. We also reduced patent pendency this year to 23.3 months, and we continue to see improvements there. We are hiring new examiners, and our attrition rate is extremely low, an indication that our technology specialists love their jobs and are challenged by new developments in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, nanotechnology, and the ever-increasing convergence between all of the science and technology disciplines. We also created a new program to expedite COVID-19 related patents. If approved into the program, we are endeavoring to reach final resolution within 6 months. Cures and treatments for this deadly disease are likely somewhere within the USPTO system. We also have undertaken a major initiative with the creation of the National Council for Expanding American Innovation. Its mission is to help develop a national innovation strategy aimed at increasing participation in the innovation economy. Today, our innovation enterprise has a shortage of women and people from diverse backgrounds and geographic locations who are not close to any of the technology hubs. In a study we published earlier this year, we found that in 2019, for example, only 13% of inventors named on US patents were female. This is an improvement since our last report, which studied patents through 2016. But much more needs to be done, and at faster rates. This is no idle exercise. IP-intensive industries pay an average salary that is 50% higher than other industries. And the approval of a startup's first patent application increases its employment growth over the next 5 years by a remarkable 36% on average. And the patent's effect on sales growth is even higher. Recent studies show that by harvesting the creative talent of all Americans, we could quadruple the number of inventors in the United States and increase the overall level of GDP per capita by up to 4.4%. This may not sound like a lot, but it amounts to about $1 trillion in GDP. The shortage of people and lack of diversity in the innovation economy comes at a time when our major global competitors have targeted our leads in innovation. They are making substantial investments in education, science, technology, commercialization, standards, and IP protections. We face an overall lack of knowledge and appreciation for intellectual property, its value, and the need to enforce protections for IP rights holders so that they can invest, invent, and commercialize new technologies. At every age, starting from kindergarten and continuing through college and beyond, we need a systemic and sustained IP educational effort to enlighten and inspire a new generation of inventors and entrepreneurs. We must broadly disseminate an understanding of why the nation's founders placed the protection of IP in the US Constitution. STEM training is still a prerequisite to sustaining a competitive and growing economy, and we must do better and train more people in STEM subject areas. But innovation training and IP education are different, and they are in addition to STEM education. We must do better there as well. To address this grand challenge, we need all hands on deck. You all are on the front lines of these efforts. I thank the Foundation for embracing this mission and for doing so much to advance its goals. Thank you for inviting me to be on this program, and I look forward to hearing from Zorina and Irving and to our conversation after their remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrei. That was super helpful. I wonder if I could just ask one quick question that goes right into the remarks that you just made. You know, when I was at the office, one of the things we struggled with in trying to get community colleges and universities interested and willing to pick up on innovation-related education, like you just very nicely said, to train students, and not just on STEM, as important as STEM is, but also to give them some training on innovation, was at the time a reluctance to break into very crowded curricula, what they would say. But something has changed, and I think it's very good that something has changed. I wonder if you've got any insight or can put your finger on what has caused universities in the intervening, really about 10 years to move from that reluctance to now not just an acceptance, but an embrace of innovation education for students.
Yeah, it's a very important and very good observation, Dave. That indeed has happened. I am actually right now in the midst of what I like to call a virtual university tour. I'm speaking to many universities virtually, just like this, almost every day, every other day. And what I've noticed is exactly what you're identifying. Many universities have tech transfer centers now. They have innovation programs They have innovation and entrepreneurship coursework. And it is so important to understand that these are in addition to, obviously, the required STEM education that we must have. So this is happening across the United States, and it's fantastic to see. Why it's happening more now than in the past, we can all just speculate. But I think there is a growing understanding among academic institutions that it's really important to have a lab to market program. There's so much innovation, and they're recognizing there's so much built innovation that goes on university campuses in so many labs across so many disciplines. And it's a shame for it not to make it not to the public domain and to market. And I think they understand that in order for that to happen, you need to at least consider intellectual property rights and various tech transfer avenues. A lot of programs, a lot of folks such as the IPO Educational Foundation, the National Academy of Inventors are also responsible for broadening the outreach and making sure that universities and academics and students see the benefits and the importance of this great work. So it really is a very good news story.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely is a major turning point and improvement. Well, thanks, Andrei. So we'll hopefully come back to that after Zorina and Irving from their university perspective, their educator perspective. So with that, I want to move over to Zorina Khan. Professor Khan, take it away.
I'm very fascinated by Andrei's real-time insights into the state of innovation in the US right now. I'm going to sort of zoom out a bit. Sorry for the very bad pun. My new book, Inventing Ideas, reminds us that the US has been the most successful economy in all of human history. But I think that right now that we're at a tipping point, and whether the 21st century will be another American century depends on the extent to which we understand the lessons of the distant past. At the time of the British Industrial Revolution, if we think about it, it's very odd that this handful of undistinguished colonies was able to rapidly overtake Europe and Asia in the 19th century. And if we ask why that was, a large part of the answer lies in the different models of innovation that were adopted. To better understand these models, we can think of a spectrum with markets for patented ideas at one end and what I call administered innovation systems, or AIS, at the other. AIS refers to arrangements where decisions about values, rewards, and the allocation of resources are made by administrators or panels. They essentially involve monopsonies. I mean, we all are familiar with monopoly, which is when you've got a single seller. A monopsony is a situation where you have a single buyer. So Europeans favored this top-down approach that highlighted the central role for the state, for elites, and for investments in costly factors, such as large-scale engineering projects. Now, elites have always mistrusted markets. Wealth and influence often lead to the conviction that the insights of the favored few can outperform decentralized coordination, and that status and celebrity are a good substitute for specialized knowledge among the masses. So Britain and France offered a vast array of administered payouts for technologies, such as medals, grants, subsidies, pensions, tax credits. And we have to ask, how well did these administered systems work in promoting useful ideas? And spoiler alert, the answer is not very well. So my book is based on the systematic empirical analysis of over 100,000 innovation prizes and patents in different countries over 2 centuries. And I have been to attics in Paris, to basements in London, and even to San Francisco. And I show that prizes and government grants were quite idiosyncratic. Elite administrators gave out awards to groups very much like themselves. Outcomes were determined by the identity of the judges and the identity of the inventors, rather than the value of the invention. For instance, I studied the award of prizes to great inventors in Britain. Now, none of the variables that we would associate with productivity or technical value were significant. The most important factor influencing whether British great inventors got a prize was whether or not they attended Oxford or Cambridge. These problems are inherent in all administered systems. Even in the US, I find that AIS unfairly discriminated against women and innovators without wealth or influence. For instance, prizes at the Franklin Institute were supposed to benefit, and I quote, ingenious men and women. However, over the 19th century, we find thousands of women got patents, but only 5 women inventors received awards from the Franklin Institute Committee. Administered awards incentivized rent-seeking and the pursuit of multiple awards rather than efforts to improve and commercialize ideas to meet market demand. It's hardly surprising that innovation prizes dwindled away by the end of the 19th century. By contrast, the modern knowledge economy had its start in the US, when, for the first time in world history, an intellectual property clause was included in a national constitution. Of course, patent systems had existed before, but largely as a means of raising revenues for the state. The objectives and design of the American patent system were unique to the world. Now, property rights are a prerequisite for a market economy. After all, somebody who grows potatoes or builds a patio is given property rights in them. So it's not through any special exception that inventive rights are secured through patent grants. Instead, American patents were based on the premise that a patent is, and I quote, property of the highest order. So attempts to restrict these, and I quote again, sacred rights of genius by measures like compulsory licensing or working requirements were continually rejected as incompatible with the principles underlying the system. As a result, the US offered the strongest patent protection in the entire world. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that secure property rights facilitate trade and market exchange. And one of the strengths of any market mechanism is its ability to calibrate compensation to value in a dynamic fashion. You know, what's valuable today might not be valuable tomorrow. Markets for patents and patent intermediaries allowed for price discovery in a manner that no administered system can possibly replicate. Any inventor with a good idea, regardless of their background, can raise funding for projects on the strength of patent rights. The ability to sell or license these rights was especially important for disadvantaged inventors without capital or connections. So what I want to point out is that the keystone of the American patent system has always been that it valued diversity in ideas and diversity in the population of innovators. For instance, the very first patent statute of 1790 stipulated that upon the petition of any person or persons that he, she, or they have invented, it shall be lawful to cause letters patent to be made out. Now, remember that this was a time when women could not vote and married women had no rights of property. The patent office itself was always been a leader in the employment of women, especially in the 19th century. And at that time, female employees received equal pay for equal work. As a result of this appreciation of innovation from the edges, we find that markets and patented ideas offered incentives to all creative members of society, including immigrants, women, Black inventors, and even economists. So my book provides substantial empirical evidence to show that patentees responded to these market incentives. For instance, during the Civil War, the New York Times reported that, and I quote, "The war has so stimulated the inventive Yankee brain that the patent office groans under the weight of instruments of destruction." We see that patents for prosthetics jumped 400% during the war, declined, and then jumped again when Congress announced that the government would pay for artificial limbs for disabled veterans. As the IP clause indicates, patents, of course, will benefit individuals, but they also benefit society. And my book emphasizes the disclosure function of patents and its role in the dissemination of innovation. Some economists assume that prizes, which don't have a legal right of exclusion, would tend to generate greater knowledge spillovers. Instead, my empirical analysis shows that patents produce significant spillovers, but prizes did not. Now, this might seem to be surprising, but in almost all administered innovation systems, you don't have any specific mechanisms to ensure that information is diffused. Whereas right from the beginning, US patent rules were designed to maximize open access to information. And there's ample evidence to show that all of this mattered. So for instance, when we look at growth paths in Europe, you find that growth was very concentrated in a few capital-intensive sectors, whereas in the US, you had balanced growth where productivity gains were distributed across the entire economy, and therefore everyone was able to benefit. In some, rapid growth was promoted by open access, democratic patent institutions, decentralized markets and ideas, and rewards that were aligned with productivity and commercial value. So let me conclude by saying that today there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the patent system, and many policymakers and economic theorists are arguing that administered innovation systems like government grants and payouts such as prizes are superior to patents. These recommendations typically are justified by anecdotes rather than data, and these anecdotes largely are false and unrepresentative. What the actual data reveal are the deficiencies of administered innovation relative to market-oriented patent policies. After all, in a prize system, there can only be one winner, and everyone else is a loser. In the patent system, everyone can be a winner. I'd like to close by quoting an observer, James Richardson, in 1878, who stated, "It's not that the patent system is perfect. No one claims that, but it is infinitely better than any substitute for it that has ever been proposed." Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kahn. That was great. And just a quick question before we move on. This discussion of prizes is, to me, just endlessly fascinating, since we've learned, as your book points out, through hundreds of years, that prizes don't even remotely approach the power of a patent system in rewarding innovation. In your research, did you find any domain, any subset in which prizes add significant value or may be applicable as a supplement to the patent system somehow?
Well, it's sort of interesting that you mentioned supplement, because the Royal Society of Arts had a rule which stated that if somebody got a prize, they couldn't apply for a patent. And so there were alternatives. And what you found was that the inventors with the valuable inventions bypassed the prize system and got rewards in the marketplace, whereas the ones with lemons then held out their hands for prizes. However, if you have a system where you have both patents and prizes, then there's the possibility that you get overcompensation. And prize systems, along with patent systems, tend to promote sort of rent seeking and people trying to pursue grants from this source and that source to sort of stack up awards. And you find that it detracts from the quest to get rewards through meeting consumer demand. But I do point out in my book that there are certain circumstances when prizes might be appropriate, such as in situations where, for instance, there aren't any markets, such as academics giving talks.
Thank you very much, Zorina.
I will
Great
look forward
answer.
to my prize.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We'll come back to your prize later. So let's turn over now to Irving Wladowsky-Berger. Irving, great to see you. Thank you very much for joining, and please take it away.
Let me thank you all for inviting me to be part of this panel with Dave, Zorina, and Andrei. I want to talk about intellectual property as innovation capital. Throughout history, major changes in technology have been accompanied by major changes in business, the economy, and society. Intellectual property is another area that's been going on major changes in our increasingly digital knowledge age. I'd like to illustrate the evolution that I have personally observed in the world of IP over the past few decades, not from some kind of abstract looking at IP, but by discussing some of my personal experiences at IBM, where I had a decades-long career as a technologist and as an executive. And I must add, some of it, I had the pleasure of working with Dave and his team in IBM's IP department, where I learned much of what I know about intellectual property. IBM has long been a leader in IP. In 2019, for example, IBM inventors received a record 9,262 US patents, the most awarded to a US company for the 27th consecutive year. IP licensing has also been a very good business for IBM, generating around $1 billion in income year in, year out, most of it going straight to the bottom line as profit. With the rise of the internet in the 1990s, the very nature of innovation started to undergo a major paradigm change, and so did IP. IP was no longer just a source of revenue and profit for IBM and other companies, but it also became a source of innovation capital to be invested and put to work on behalf of the IT industry and the overall economy. These paradigm changes, in my opinion, have been taking place along three key dimensions. First, from lab-based to market-facing. Instead of being primarily based on physical technologies and products coming out of R&D labs, much of the innovation and accompanying IP is now focused on market-facing systems and applications, whose building blocks include software, algorithm, and services. Second major dimension is the evolution from proprietary to open. This increased focus on market-facing innovation has been accompanied by the growing importance of open standards, open source software, and other technologies that now enable us to better interconnect, communicate, and conduct business with each other. And third, from firm-centric to collaborative. As a result, rather than being primarily centered on individual firms, innovation has now become much more collaborative in nature. Let me illustrate these points with a couple of personal stories. In the late 1980s, the internet was already widely used in research labs and universities. But then around the early 1990s, internet technologies, including the newly developed World Wide Web and browsers, became increasingly popular in the wider world of business. By the mid-1990s, it was increasingly clear that the future of the IT industry would be based on the internet. And in December of 1995, I became the general manager of a newly launched IBM Internet division. Our mission was to develop IBM's overall Internet strategy and to oversee its implementation across the whole company. We did so over the next 4 years, and by the end of 1999, the Internet had been so well embraced across the whole company, the IT industry in general, that we disbanded the Internet division. Now, the Internet job was quite different from any previous position I had held. There was no one technology or product that you could work on in the labs that would make you a success. This time around, the strategy had to come from the marketplace, not the labs. In addition, embracing the Internet, its open standards and open source software implementations turned out to be much more than a technology change. It also had a very big impact on the overall culture of the IT industry and of companies like IBM, which became much more open and collaborative. Let me now turn to my experiences with Linux. Linux was first released by Linus Torvalds in 1991 as an open source Unix-like operating system that anyone could download from the internet. Linux was overseen by a community of some of the best and brightest programmers in the world that were led by Linus Torvalds. Any individual or institution could contribute software, which, if accepted, would be included in future releases of Linux. In the early years, Linux was primarily used in the supercomputing, research, and internet communities. But by 1999, Linux interest was increasing in the more general IT marketplace. And later that year, IBM made the decision to embrace Linux across all its hardware, software, and service offerings, as well as to partner with the global Linux community and to contribute to its development. In January of 2000, IBM announced the formation of a new company-wide organization to coordinate its various Linux activities with me at the helm. Our announcement actually got a mixed reception. While many welcomed our strong support of Linux, many others still thought of Linux as an operating system developed by a bunch of hackers, some with names like Mad Dog Hall, and were perplexed that IBM was so aggressively supporting an initiative that, in their opinion, was so removed from the IT mainstream. So a big part of our job was to articulate why we supported Linux. We said that we viewed Linux as part of the evolution toward the open standards and software that were necessary to help integrate disparate systems and applications over the internet. We also explained that Linux was the only operating system that ran on every single platform, regardless of vendor or architecture, which then made it much easier to port software across any platform. We were convinced that Linux was going to be a success in the marketplace, and so it eventually became, but not without considerable pain and effort. For several years, some of the companies who viewed Linux as a competitive threat attacked pretty ferociously not only IBM, but also the overall Linux community, as well as the companies that use Linux. Some describe Linux as akin to communism. In 2003, the SEO group filed a $1 billion lawsuit against IBM, an amount later increased to $5 billion, alleging that IP had contributed SEO's intellectual property to the Linux community. To help defend Linux, IBM and other companies then contributed a number of important patents which the individual companies owned to the Linux community, so that the Linux community had a set of patents that they could use to defend themselves if needed. SEO, as I remember, filed for bankruptcy protection in 2007, but the lawsuit dragged on for years. And Dave, I'm not even sure if it's over. Let me conclude by briefly mentioning a few of the key technologies that will continue to drive IP and innovation over the next several decades, starting with digital technologies. Digital technologies have kept nations and economies going during the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has now made the case for accelerating the digital transformation of private and public institutions. We can expect to accelerate the deployment of ultra-high-speed broadband bandwidth, 5G, IoT, and universal internet access, as well as critical improvements to cybersecurity and data privacy. We can also expect important innovations in online e-applications that the pandemic forced on us, but have worked remarkably well, including remote work, distance learning, virtual meetings, telemedicine, and many others. Second, artificial intelligence. After decades of failed promises and hype, AI is finally becoming one of the most important technologies of the digital age, as the critical ingredients have finally come together. Huge amounts of all kinds of information, advanced algorithms like machine and deep learning, and powerful, inexpensive computer technologies. Companies have been slow to embrace AI, but we can expect the adoption of AI technologies and applications to also significantly increase. And last but not least, blockchain technologies. And including, I must say, technologies like smart contracts and digital tokens. The essence of blockchain is that the unit of competition is no longer the single enterprise, but the network ecosystem. Over the next few decades, and it will take time, blockchain-based network ecosystems will help us improve the security and efficiency of mission-critical complex applications like supply chains, financial services, shipping and transportation, and healthcare, significantly transforming economies and societies. It's been a fascinating last few decades, and Dave, I expect the next few decades to be at least as equally interesting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Irving. That was fantastic. And I just love the way you're able to put not only a historical context around so many major trends that have shaped our lives and our workplace and our economy, but also to project them forward. And, you know, I can't help but ask one question. You mentioned AI and blockchain, these incredibly important technologies that benefit from, as you said, you know, three trends coming together. At the root of all of them, I find data, massive amounts of data, PII, personally identifiable data, yes, and that's got, as you said, its own special characteristics, but more generally, just gigantic amounts of data. Could you just briefly give your observations about, you know, when we're going to see a data industry form the same way we saw a software industry form 3-4 decades ago. It just feels to me like someday there are going to be companies that'll call themselves data companies, and kids getting bachelor degrees in data sciences and not just PhDs. Talk a little about that.
First of all, kids are getting degrees in data science. And in fact, this semester, every fall for the last several years, MIT Sloan School of Management, where my appointment is at MIT, teaches a course called Analytics Lab. And I'm involved mentoring a group of students. And these students are not in computer science. So their job is not to develop mathematical or statistical algorithms. Their job is to learn how to use data to solve business problems, economics problems, societal problems. And in fact, I think that what we are seeing is the datafication of society. Now, that is very difficult, especially because we now are trying to apply analytics and AI and related technologies, not just in the natural sciences where, to first order, it's a piece of cake because, black holes and electrons are very difficult, but people are infinitely more difficult. And as we are now using data in the social sciences, in the humanities, across all disciplines, to try to predict human behavior, boy, is that going to be fascinating. And as I think we can see from just the predictions of how voters will vote in elections, it's really difficult. Humans are not machines like airplanes, and they don't follow gravitational laws like planets. Humans, quote unquote, have a mind on their own. And I suspect that the USPTO will see more and more and more fascinating innovations in this area of predicting human behavior and organizational behavior, which will help us tremendously.
Yeah, thanks, Irving. Well, that's great. I'd like to bring it back, first of all, and say, I want to talk about education a bit. We've got 3 people who have educational mandates here, one running an agency with an educational mandate and 2 at great academic institutions. And I want the audience to be cognizant that we actually are coming up on our 45-minute time here, but we're going to keep going because this is just way too interesting to stop. And so if you'd like to stay on, please do, and enjoy some more of the conversation with some discussion here. So with that, I'd like to bring Andrei and Zorina back into the discussion to talk just a little bit, and Irving, of course, to talk a little bit from your perspectives, all of you, about students, and particularly what is it that students need to know about intellectual property in order to appreciate its role in accelerating innovation. It can't be that they need to know about section 101, 102, and 103. There's got to be some core message that's at a much higher level. So I wonder if you could all just talk a little bit about that core message.
Sure. So look, I think the core message that students and others, frankly, need to understand is that IP is the driving force of the innovation ecosystem that we have all gotten so used to. It wasn't always like this in human history. Think about just 200 years ago when this country was first established. It took 2 weeks to get the message that the Declaration of Independence was signed from Philadelphia to Williamsburg, Virginia. About the same time, it took Alexander the Great to send a message in 331 BC about his great victory in the Middle East back to his capital. You know, humans have been around for so long, but the state of the human condition when this country and the constitutional IP system were established, it was basically the same as it was in antiquity. So I very much believe that the constitutional IP system that Zorina spoke about so well really created the democratized invention. It created this pro-competitive system that is responsible for exponential growth, the likes of which humanity simply has not known until this day. And let me illustrate with a particular example. In 1893, there was the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. All the technologies we know about from the 20th century, or many of them, were exhibited there for the first time in Chicago in 1893. You know, escalators and Bell's new telephone, not to mention the great technological advancement of Pabst beer and Wrigley's gum. But the one that stole the show was electricity. And there was this huge battle between Edison and Westinghouse at the exposition in 1893, between Edison's DC systems and all the peripheral equipment and Westinghouse's AC system and its peripheral equipment. Westinghouse won that battle in 1893 to power the show. And to this day, AC dominates the worldwide standards for electricity. But let's think back how this came about. Edison, brilliant guy, obviously, and not shy about getting patents. Until very recently, he still was the #1 patent holder in the United States as an individual. He's been overtaken now, but he had a lot of patents. So patents really incentivized him to innovate. So would Edison have first invented the light bulb and the DC circuitry without patents and the promise of a patent? I don't know. Probably not. He probably would have done something else. But let's say that he did. What would George Westinghouse have done? He sees Edison's new technology. He wants a piece of it. What would he have done most likely if there was no patent protection on Edison's sphere of innovation surrounding electricity? Most likely, on average, he would have likely just copied what Edison has done and tried to outmarket him, which happens time and again when there's no IP protection. But because he couldn't, because Edison was also not shy about using his patents in court to enforce his area of protection, it forced Westinghouse to team up with Tesla and develop a brand new system, perhaps better and certainly different, to the benefit of society. This happens time and time again. So the IP system first incentivizes the original innovation. It then incentivizes the disclosure of that innovation to the public, as opposed to maintaining it secret the way it used to be in the old days. And third, most importantly, it incentivizes and teaches the next inventor to come up with something else, something different, perhaps something better. This pro-competitive exponential growth is created as a result of the patent system. And folks, if they understand that, I think they would understand the fundamental engine that this democratic system our country has created when it comes to innovation is responsible for the amazing technological growth we've had here for the past couple hundred years.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrei. So IP as an accelerant to the creation, dissemination of new technologies. Zorina, what do you say to students about this?
First, I want to say that I had not expected that Andrei would be preempting me as an economic historian. But I would agree with him, obviously, that history matters. And I would also emphasize that facts and data matter. And it isn't sufficient just to have facts and data on, say, today or even the past 2 years. I want to point out that if we don't have a sense of the broad patterns over time, that we can tend to be guilty of what someone has called chronocentricity, the sense that, or the time that we live in is very special. And one particular place where I see this as a problem is in terms of the notion that somehow the patent system is collapsing because there's too much litigation. But if we consider the course of litigation over the past 200 years, actually litigation has been a very productive part of the patent system. And the patterns that we observe today are far from anomalous. In fact, patenting relative to the population of inventions, or litigation relative to the population of inventions, is lower than it was in the early period. So we need to realize that wherever you have great value, you're going to have disputes. And litigation is a very orderly way to resolve these sorts of disputes. And even if we consider, say, the greatest inventions, they were associated not just with litigation about patents, but about every single part of society. They involve litigations about contracts, about torts, about crime, about property. So positioning litigation in time and in terms of this context of the overall transformations that inventions make in society leads us to realize that really we don't have to be concerned about this aspect. And I also want to emphasize the point that Andrei was making and to speculate about what happens in the absence of patents. So if we don't have this right of exclusion through the legal system, then the world doesn't collapse. Instead, private actors will find alternative ways to secure their ideas. So for instance, companies can replicate exclusion through bilateral contracts, or they can engage in technological encryption. You can also have just lock your door and keep all of the ideas secret. So it's not that you can't have a right of exclusion, but we have to be very aware that these alternative methods come at a huge cost to society, because when that happens, we don't have the disclosure of information that we get through the patent system. And although today nothing might change, in the future, we would expect to see a lower rate of innovation owing to the fact that the potential competitors in the technological field don't have access to this information. And of course, in a purely objective matter, I would suggest to students that they read my book.
Well, thanks, Rita. Yeah, and I'm hearing the same theme or a similar theme, the disclosure feature of the patent system, which has been a major positive since the very beginning. Irving, you're at the world's greatest technological university, MIT. What do you tell students about what's so great about intellectual property?
In MIT, one of the things I like so much about MIT is that when people come up with a great idea, yes, it's good to publish, but that's not as sweet as taking a new product or service or innovation to market based on their idea. I think that's part of what they see all around them. And so if you want to encourage people to be entrepreneurs, to start businesses, to create new things, intellectual property must go along with that. Because without intellectual property, boy, it would be the Wild West when you come to market with a new idea and somebody comes along and says, wait a second, I had that idea yesterday and I'm going to kill you if you don't stop doing your idea. So now we have an orderly way of deciding whose idea is whom. If the other company wants your idea, that's okay. we have a mechanism, we'll license it for you. You can pay us money, or as you know so much better than me, David, if they have ideas that I want, and I have ideas that they want, we can cross-license each other patents. And it's fair to say that most companies truly cross-license their patent portfolios with each other, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because they want the freedom of action to be able to do very complex products without having to worry about each individual patent. Let me add another point. If the student came and said, well, Irving, you talk so much about Linux and open standards and open source. Why do we need patents? Well, because if you want to protect open source, you need to own the patents that you use for that protection. So the fact that the business community was able to stand behind Linux and protect it with their patent is because they own patents. So if the, let me not call them bad guys, the people who were against Linux for whatever reason wanted to mount major lawsuits as they threaten against our clients who use Linux, you would say, hey guys, wait a second. Look at this huge number of patents. And I bet you that if we crawl through your software, we'll find out that you're infringing on quite a number. And at that point, everybody calms down a bit.
So this is a theme that I find myself using in speaking with students too. You want to have impact, you're right, you're going to have great ideas at a place like MIT. You want to have impact, you need to have some way to take those ideas into the marketplace. And the patent provides your mechanism for taking those ideas and creating marketplace impact with them. So super. Well, look, we're time for just one more quick question for everyone. And to do that, I'd like to come back to something that I know at least Zorina and Andrei have mentioned, which is the issue of diversity and the intellectual property system, the patent system in particular, being a mechanism, a tool, a champion for promoting diversity in innovation. And so I wonder if you could just each comment briefly on, from your perspective, what do you see as opportunities to promote diversity in innovation, and what you'd like to see the government, business, and the academy do to promote greater diversity in innovation. Let's start with Zorina and then come back to Irving and let Andrei have the last word then. Zorina?
When I look at the patent system right from the beginning, as I pointed out, the fundamental feature of the US patent system relative to others is that in other countries, they felt that special people were the only ones who ought to get these rights. Whereas in the US, there was this conviction that everyone has the capacity to be creative, and you just need to give them appropriate incentives. So then it comes across as sort of peculiar when we look at the data on, say, women's participation in patents, and we see that today maybe 12% of patents are going to women. But I'm not so sure that these patterns are owing to anything systemic in the US Patent Office. I think that if women aren't involved in patenting, it is related to broader patterns outside of the patent system. For instance, that women are being employed in jobs that are not sort of patent appropriate. And I would also want to say that we need to, of course, acknowledge that there is an enormous amount of creativity in technology and in innovation in general outside of the patent system. And my research shows that women are significantly more likely than men to produce valuable but unpatentable innovations, for instance, in the look and feel of consumer final goods, or new inventions that are the boundaries of art and technology that might not be susceptible to patents. So I think that we need to find better ways to measure creativity broadly, but of course, to also focus on specific policies that might remove any obstacles to groups that are not fully engaged in the patent system.
Yeah, good point. Measurement is important, right? And that is definitely part of what's going on. Irving?
Traditionally, the areas, the disciplines that produce the most patents, the people who were working on them in science and engineering and so on happened to be male and happened to be white males for the most part. One of the nice things that's happening in innovation is, first of all, we are getting more gender diversity in those disciplines, and we're getting more underrepresented minorities who are part of those disciplines, and that's very good. But even better, the innovation and the opportunity for intellectual property is now expanding across just about all disciplines. As in the question, Dave, you asked me about the use of data, that, it's in the social sciences, it's in marketing, it's in advertising. In MIT, as an example with gender, I believe the latest things I saw is there are still not enough women in the engineering disciplines, the classic engineering discipline, maybe 25%. But my God, in the biological sciences, the number is huge. At least 50%, maybe even bigger. And I'm sure Andrei will tell me, you must be seeing more and more intellectual property, patents, and so on in all the different biological science disciplines. And so there is a lot of stuff there. And then, as we discussed, the social sciences, I think, will have a lot of stuff. So I think the world of innovation, and let me call it patentable knowledge, is becoming more diverse in multiple dimensions, with the classic disciplines having a more diverse population, but with expanding innovation and the ability to write patents to quite a few more disciplines that have been themselves more diverse in nature.
Great answer. Super helpful, Irving. And, it's great to see improvement anywhere and everywhere. Andrei, the field is set for you to finish our panel here.
First, let me just answer Irving's point. Indeed, we do see a significantly higher percentage of women inventors in the biological sciences than in the rest of the field by a significant margin. We published a report just this year, Progress and Potential. It's actually an update of a prior report that breaks it down by industry, by state, and many other measures. And we indeed see that the companies that are in the biosciences field have a higher participation of women. However, it's really interesting. It is the rate of innovation across industry for women is still lower at about 50% as that of their male counterparts. What do I mean by this? First of all, let's extract out when we look at the entirety of the US workforce, slightly over 50% of jobs are held by women in the United States overall. Yet only 28% of STEM jobs are held by women. So first and foremost, at this first level, we see that we need to do a lot better to have more women engineers, more scientists across the board in the United States. But then, even though there are 28% of women in STEM jobs in the United States, on average, only 13% of women of inventors named on US patents are women. What does this mean? It means that approximately that women invent, as we see on patents, as measured by patents, at about half the rate as their male counterparts. These are women who are already educated in the right fields. They are already hired and in the seats in the jobs at companies. And this rate is about the same across industries, including in the biosciences. Irving is right. Even though the biosciences show about 50% women employment rate, only about 28%, 27% are named on US patents. And then in the high-tech area, even though we see women in high-tech jobs, coding and the like at about 25%, only 12, 13% are named on US patents. So we're losing folks who are already in the seats. So what can we do? I believe we need a national strategy. We need a focused attention to this issue. We need to think about an inventor's career along a timeline that begins really at birth or very close to it, with kindergarten education, middle school education, high school, college, and then of course employment, access to the IP system, and then access to capital and commercialization. Think about the timeline. Look at each one of these touch points. How are we doing? Where are we losing people? I'll bet you we're not losing people at kindergarten. Okay, we're doing a good job at kindergarten. But are we already losing girls and minority kids by middle school? Are we losing more kids by high school? Where are we losing them? I know we're losing them in the jobs because I just mentioned the statistics on that. And then once we figure out where along this path we're losing folks, let's figure out specific solutions at each one of these touch points. And they're going to be different for each one of the different touch points. And then, most important, we should not just be talking about things. We need measurable results. We need a way to tangibly measure how we are doing, how our solutions are progressing. And if we're not doing a good job based on these measurements, we need to change course, figure something else out. The way we're measuring with patents is one measure. I'm sure there are other ways to measure. So we need this concerted, systematic effort, and we need government, industry, and academia working together in collaboration in a concerted fashion. So among other things, that's why I'm grateful for the IPO Education Foundation. The foundation has seen this for a long time. You're all working on it. So I want to thank you all for that and to thank you for this great panel. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. That's a great closeout, Andrei. Really terrific. Well, look, let me now thank the three panelists, Andrei Iancu, Director of the USPTO, Zorina Khan, Professor at Bowdoin College, and Irving Wladowsky-Berger, Professor at MIT. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic panel and a great discussion.
Thank you very much, Dave. You have done a wonderful job as moderator, asking all the right questions and laughing in the right places.
Thanks, Rita. Always a pleasure to work with you guys. Okay, thanks, Irving. Thanks, Andrei. Have a great evening, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.